Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends, dear Streamline watchers, good afternoon, everybody. I am Director of the Institute of International Affairs, Andris Sprūds, and today, of course, I have the great pleasure to welcome you at the seminar on Central Asia, which will be focused more on security issues in the heart of Asia. But when we speak about security, of course, this discussion takes place in the shadow of shocking Paris attacks, preceded by Beirut attacks and followed by Bamako attacks in Mali. We have experienced a very tragic human loss. And now European capitals, of course, are on high alert, but we can say essentially that Europeanism is on high alert as we face risks of renationalization of our immigration and security policy. And basically, we may say that once more, Euro-Atlantic solidarity and strength is being tested and will be tested. Central Asia has experienced threat of terrorism already for some time. Central Asia is not only located in the heart of Asia, but also in the proximity of quite a challenging, destabilizing region. And there are risks of spillover, of crime, extremism, and also instability. So that's why, of course, when we speak about security here, we must also think wider. As some would say that terrorism is an increasingly plague of the 21st century. Some would even say that this is a revanche of God or revanche of religion in the 21st century. But we still should remember that also geopolitics matter, that geopolitics remain as an important part of the game as well. And heart of Asia, or Central Asia, is one of the only regions where actually all interests of great powers, in a sense, collide and collude. We may speak about China, we may speak about the United States, European Union, India, Pakistan, Turkey, so name almost any of the great power is having interest in the region. And the region, of course, is very much connected and the security dynamic related with the neighborhood, with Afghanistan and Pakistan. But of course, we should still remember the broader geopolitical environment. Russia's adventurism in Ukraine, we might call it also the Russia's aggression in Ukraine, of course, has shaken the whole post-Soviet space. And the ghosts of revisionism, ghosts of the geopolitical games, ghosts of playing zero-sum games, and concerns of this have appeared in the region as well. Moreover, we must remember that Central Asia is not a homogeneous region. We sometimes put it in the same box, but there are 5 different countries. Countries with their own agenda, with own impact on regional and security dynamic. And also domestic politics. They reveal quite a number of vulnerabilities, quite a number of challenges which we will be facing in the future. Latvia has been actively engaged with Central Asia. Latvia has showed interest and expertise in the region in recent years. We've been willing to place Central Asia on agenda of the NATO and also the European Union. This was one of the priorities of the European EU presidency or EU Council presidency. I might add that we will be discussing the Central Asia as a part of European global strategy discussion here in February or March with Ms. Mogherini potentially also coming. Cooperation in the context of NATO might be even longer. International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan, which was absolutely connected and also involving the Central Asian countries. We had the NDN, or Northern Distribution Network, in the past, and it was important for us to even connect not just politically and security-wise, but also in terms of economics. And also recently, before Estonia, Latvian embassy was a contact point of the NATO, embassy of the NATO in Kazakhstan as well. So it shows the interest on number of dimensions. Security, politically, also in terms of economics as well and trade. Clearly, this would be impossible, this developing of our own expertise and cooperation without important and mutually reinforcing partnerships. Here I would mention, since it is supported by NATO, of course, I would mention NATO as an important partner, which supports also debate on especially security issues, security agenda in the region, especially what is going on after withdrawal from Afghanistan. But of course, also this demonstrates the positive dynamic and spirit of engagement among us as well, among the Baltic countries, European Union representatives, and also the Central Asian country representatives. So we are very happy to have the wide range of speakers representing different countries. Especially I would thank our Central Asian guests here for coming and sharing their opinions as well. Last but not least, of course, thanks for coming, I must say, to the friends and to the colleagues here in the audience. For our partners who've been cooperating with us also here in the region and helping develop expertise and connections with Central Asian countries. And here I am happy to immediately give a floor to Lolita Čigāne, who is a chair, the head of the European Affairs Committee of Latvian Parliament. I see a number of Latvian parliamentarians, and it's very good that we have Latvian Parliament also represented here. But Lolita, the floor is yours. You've been also quite actively involved. You've been participating in some of the Central Asian activities. So please, the floor is yours to give your keynote speech here. Please.
Thank you so much, Andri. I am actually not intending to really give a keynote speech in its proper sense of the word, because I think that we have a really excellent panel of experts who will each give their view on the topic. So I will just give a few words of introduction. First of all, I would like to thank Andris and also all his colleagues of Latvian Institute of International Affairs for doing such an excellent job. You did an excellent job during our presidency, and you really brought up the level of think tank approach and think tank thinking of international affairs and European affairs during our presidency, and I'm very glad to see that you are continuing to do so. And for us politicians, you know what politicians are like. We sometimes just look for venues and events where we can show ourselves, listen to ourselves speaking, and showing ourselves to the public. But your specific events of your institute have actually been the events where I have myself found a lot of intriguing debates, really new insights, and excellent speakers, and very well conducted debates. So thank you for that. And just generally, broadly speaking about the Central Asia and Central Asian issues, yes, Andris mentioned I have had a personal professional experience with several Central Asian countries, and I find the region extremely fascinating and also very close to a Latvian heart, because obviously we were in the one big former Soviet space. But there is one very interesting aspect in the European Union, and also probably in NATO to some extent, that we can observe. And it is focusing and concentrating on one particular issue that comes to the agenda at that point. Of course, to some extent, it reflects the way how specifically the European Union has been built. It is an ad hoc, to some extent still, although there are well-grounded institutions already functioning for many years, but still there is an ad hoc decision-making. And sometimes you go to meetings and you know that the agenda is actually very complex and there are many issues that are important at that point in time, but we find our leaders of 28 European Union member states focusing on this particular topic. And it's understandable, because all of them are also domestic politicians, and they have to deal with their domestic agendas, and they urgently gather to solve this particular problem. And we know very well that over the course of the last 2 years, it has been, first of all, Greek economic crisis, then it was the Russian aggression in Ukraine, then those were issues of Eastern Partnership, and of course now the big question of migration has entered the agenda. And sometimes you even feel a little uneasy that you try to bring up other agenda topics in these meetings, because people feel, why are you talking about this? This is irrelevant. But for such a big bloc of 500 million as the European Union is, and bears such an important and big responsibility for the functioning of the world, of the global world order, we cannot at all, at any point, ignore the complexities of the world. And I believe and firmly stand for the fact that Central Asia is very important, and we have to keep our focus going and seeing the developments, what are happening in the Central Asia. In case we somehow ignore it for some time, we might face a much bigger problem, because unaddressed issues, unaddressed problems, unaware politicians of the issues that are being pertinent to a concrete region are very dangerous for such a big global player. So I'm very proud and happy that Latvia can play this role of putting Central Asian issues on the table of the European Union and keep this focus going in a calm, balanced manner where we analyze the developments, point out potential dangers, and really foster the debate of the European Union in this respect to help everyone, even those who do not have Central Asian region that close to their hearts, so that they would understand much better what's going on there. So I'm very happy to open this event today. I wish everyone excellent discussions, and I'm very happy to be participating and listening in. Thank you.
Thank you, Lolita. Thank you for having your thoughts. Always appreciate your presence and your insights. But now I'm happy to give the floor to Igors Apokins, who has been basically insider in Central Asia. In diplomacy, you use the term go native. I hope you have not gone fully native, but of course you know very well what's going on in the region. You've been a long-standing ambassador in the region, and you are still very much connected to Central Asia. So please, Ambassador Igors Apokins, representing the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Please, Igor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. First of all, I'm very glad to participate to this conference and to make some words connecting to Central Asian problematic. And I'm very honored to be among so honored audience here. So what I would like to be mentioned during my presentation, why Central Asian region became so important for Latvia and why we proclaim it one of the top priorities for presidency. It was important, of course, to renew and to remind European colleagues about problematic of Central Asian region, and in particular during our presidency, because it's really a very important region for stability and security in Europe. And it became more and more clear during last events, what happened in Paris and in some African countries and so on. During our presidency, as you know, we main topics were Eastern Partnership and Central Asia. Why we are proclaimed as rather good experts in Central Asian issues? Because we got, first of all, good connections. We got our diplomatic presentations in 2 Central Asian countries. We got 2 ambassadors and a staff of 2 embassies, covered the whole Central Asian region. And of course, the presence of our diplomats there make us a bigger expertise than our neighbors and some European countries to be raising this issue as great importance for Europe. Of course, it has to be mentioned that many topics is important in the sense of Central Asian problematic for not only for Latvia but also for European countries. Of course, it's first of all it's security, second it's education and sustainable development. A lot of events and brainstorming conferences were organized during Latvian presidency. It make rise a great interest among our European colleagues toward these topics. And as Lolita mentioned, it was really very surprisingly make a surprise for some of our colleagues why Central Asia were chosen. But we suppose that much more attention have to be paid to this region in the sense of security, and in the future it could be more important in the sense of energy, security, trafficking, human rights, and so on. And all these topics were very good developed during activities of Latvian presidents at the beginning of first half of this year. As I mentioned, many events were taking place here in transport sector, in human rights, in transportation, education, and so on the very high level. And we achieved a very good presence from Central Asian countries on highest level, at least ministerial level. It was very surprisingly just taken from European colleagues, because, as we know, there is no regional cooperation existing in so big scale as we used to have in the European Union. As to security of the region, it's important to be mentioned that importance of this region became very important after events taking place in Afghanistan and developing of Afghani situation for many decades. And I see here a lot of hardened persons just know this problematic better than me, but I think it will be discussed during our discussions today. Latvia played a crucial role in Northern Distribution Network, connecting Afghanistan and Latvia and the European Union for some period of time, for many years. And this was really very important, not only economically, but geostrategically for the whole European Union. Situation in Afghanistan and further development of security situation in Iraq, in Syria, is very connecting to Central Asia from security reasons. You know, it's many people from Central Asia is participating in war operations in Syria, and not only, and more than 3,000 people, but the figure is not maybe very correct, but it could be bigger. So this influence of the unsecure development in the region through Afghanistan and Central Asia could be influenced also not only Latvia, but through Latvia and through other neighboring countries and the European countries, so the whole EU situation. So because of that, we suppose that we made a very correct choice and just take this problematic as one of the priorities during our presidency. Of course, it was a reminder to our colleagues in EU that the region will be playing more and more important role. Very important to be mentioned strategy, reviewing of strategy during Latvian presidency, which was launched on 2007, and it was high time to review the strategy, which is very important for further planning and activities of European organizations and structures in Central Asian region, which was done very successfully, starting from the joint paper of Latvian-German joint paper concerning strategy towards Central Asia. I think probably it's all what I would like to mention as the opening speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you for outlining what has been our interest and what we have been doing already in the region. And we heard, including myself actually, the Latvian perspective. But I think it is very important to proceed and to understand the perspective of our European partners, NATO partners, and also Central Asian country representatives. So without any delay, I am immediately giving the floor to Nargis Kassenova, and I will introduce my other colleagues, distinguished panel speakers in a due course. But I'm introducing Nargis Kassenova, who is KIMEP University fellow and a professor from Kazakhstan. And I would kindly ask 5, maximum 7 minutes, to be very short, so that we can engage in a discussion as well. And perhaps the issue is the security and how Kazakhstan, what kind of security risks are facing at the moment, and what are the biggest challenges? Please, Nargis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I know I have only 5-7 minutes, but nevertheless, I want to thank the Institute and also Latvian policymakers for their interest in the region and the work that is done to strengthen the relations between EU and Central Asia, because I think that it's incredibly important and has long-term implications. These are difficult times. It's becoming more challenging to maintain these relations, to deepen them, but I believe that therefore it's even more important to do that. As was already mentioned, I will talk about the Kazakhstani perspective, the security concerns that we have, and then I'll reflect a little bit on Kazakhstan-NATO partnership. For a long time, Kazakhstan prided itself on being the island of stability, a paragon of harmonious interethnic, interconfessional relations, emerging economy, emerging power. The strong insecurities we had in the early 90s, that is fear of Russian separatism in the north, and then territorial dispute with China, they were gone. Of course, there were concerns about spillovers of instability from neighboring states, implications of Islamic revival, Islamism in the region, drug trafficking, human trafficking. But in a way, these were normal security challenges that didn't undermine the overall sense of stability. However, this sense of stability was shattered, starting with 2011. In 2011, we had a number of terrorist acts, explosions in a couple of cities of Kazakhstan that were claimed by local Junta al-Khalifa organizations. These explosions were very poorly organized, but nevertheless, they were quite shocking for the government, and they were shocking for the society at large. In December that year, we had Janauzen. Maybe you heard about Janauzen. Basically, this was a labor dispute that ended up in a bloody way, in riots that were very, very harshly suppressed. It was in the western oil-producing areas of Kazakhstan. And another big shock, the third big shock, was, of course, the Ukrainian crisis, 2014. The annexation of Crimea that undermined the pillar of security arrangement in the post-Soviet space. So the principle of inviolability of borders, as they were at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, was challenged. So these three shocks that we had, they correspond to three current top security concerns. First, it's jihadist Islamist threat. Second is destabilization, caused by mobilization that is due to socio-economic grievances, and separatism, interethnic tensions. First, I'll talk a little bit about the jihadist threat, what the government has done. In response to these explosions, the government undertook some restrictive measures. The new law on religious organizations and activities was adopted immediately in October 2011. So all the religious organizations had to re-register. So the previous registration was cancelled. And but the new conditions were quite challenging to fulfill. And basically, it affected all religious organizations, not only Islamic, of course, but if we talk about Islamic, only those that were supported by official Muslim associations, so there were Sunni, Hanafi, were allowed. And Shia, Ahmadi, so other basically non-traditional Islamic organizations that were refused the registration. So basically what this law did was pushing underground many religious organizations and activities. The other legal structures regarding, basically legal structures regarding terrorism were also strengthened, tightened. The new article in the criminal code that dealt with financing of terrorist and extremist activities and other complicity in terrorism or extremism was adopted, and you could get up to 8 years in prison for engaging in these activities. Anti-terrorist center was set up. A program for combating terrorism was adopted for 2013-2017. So basically, the government adopted some measures. And it seemed more or less good for some time, but then we had the ISIS crisis, and we found out that quite a few Kazakhstani citizens went to Iraq, Syria, and joined this organization. According to our National Security Committee, there are 300 citizens there. Probably there are more. And interestingly, half of them are women. Well, some experts say that they go there because they want to find husbands, or so for personal reasons. But anyways, and there are some families there. To deal with that, once again, the government adopted some new legislation, and the participation in military conflicts abroad is a criminal case in Kazakhstan. So you can get sentences of imprisonment for 3-7 years. And there were already trials for that, trials for people who went to Syria and came back. So the government basically doesn't know what to do with these people. They hope that they will not come back, since they will be facing these criminal charges. There was also a case last week when a young woman went on trial for trying to send her younger brother to join Daesh, and she was sentenced to 6 years. So, I already said that the government response is to emphasize punitive measures. And they are trying to do some anti-religious propaganda less successfully. The second threat, socio-economic grievances. Here the government organized some investigations, hearings. Some activists were punished. At the same time, some government officials responsible were removed. Okay. So and also the money was the money was spent on improving the situation in these depressed regions. I have to summarize things. If you summarize it, the government is supposed to spend more money, try to prevent these future disputes, conflicts, and to punish. Okay. Now it's becoming more difficult to do that because of the worsening economic situation. Oil prices went down. There is Russian economic crisis that affected us. The revenues in the budget for this year, the government already said that they will be contracted 40%. So there is less money to spend to alleviate this conflict potential. Still, the government has some safety cushions. We have reserves. The deficit is small, but it's becoming more problematic. It's becoming more problematic. We have monocities, economy is contracting. There is this internal migration, etc., etc. The Ukrainian crisis. Kazakhstan got into a very difficult situation. On the one hand, you can draw parallels with Ukraine. There is Budapest Memorandum that didn't give any security guarantees, other agreements and so on. On the other hand, Russia is our principal strategic ally. And we have a very high level of security cooperation with it. We have economic integration partners and so on. And this difficult situation resulted in a very confused response. The government on the one hand, supported the referendum, said that it's a free expression of free will of people of Crimea. On the other hand, all the other statements confirmed the principle of territorial sovereignty. And then at the General Assembly, UN General Assembly, when there was this resolution on Russia, Kazakhstan abstained, together with China. So we don't want to offend Russia, but at the same time, the principle of territorial integrity is an very important principle for us. Yes. Okay. The government has been punishing anything that smells of separatism. Okay. So there have been some sentences lately. One was a blogger, yeah, in the town of Riga. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison for moderating a vote in a social network. Okay, if the town of Riga should join Russia or not, let's imagine that. Let's imagine a vote. Okay, so, and he was accused for a call to separatism, and we had some other cases as well. So basically, this border between private, public, between social networks and mass media is not very clear. So you can get a sentence for anything that happens on your page on Facebook, whatever. So. Okay, then there is Afghanistan, of course. Yeah, it's a second-tier problem for Kazakhstan. Yes, Kazakhstan is concerned, but less than its neighbors. Yeah, and the response was to strengthen the southern borders and to engage in multilateral arrangements. You know, kind of to improve the situation, provide humanitarian assistance, and so on. Now, a couple of words, if I may, about cooperation NATO for 1 minute.
Half a minute.
Half a minute. Okay. So, well, Kazakhstan has the strongest cooperation with NATO. We are the only country, of course, that has the EPAP, and there is a NATO training center in Almaty. There are regular exercises. There is combined Endeavour C4 exercise. There is, of course, the Step Eagle that takes place in Kazakhstan. Yeah. That is aimed at increasing interoperability between Kazakhstani peacekeepers and NATO, and of course cooperation with NATO and NATO countries is very important for modernization of armed forces in Kazakhstan, and it manages, for the moment, Kazakhstan manages to maintain this cooperation despite the current antagonism between Russia and the West. Can cooperation with NATO address key security challenges that are addressed? Jihadist threat to some extent. And, well, clearly Western approaches, NATO approaches to this problem are more advanced than Kazakhstani one, but we know that the West so far hasn't developed a proper response itself. The socio-economic system, that's not NATO's, of course, role to do that. Separatism, inter-ethnic clashes, the role is limited as well. Cooperation with NATO and NATO countries helps Kazakhstan to reduce its dependence on Russia, but of course for Kazakhstan it's important not to overdo it, so not to repeat the destiny of Georgia and Ukraine. So, so basically at the moment cooperation with NATO is more important for dealing with second-tier security challenges, yeah? Like border control, drug trafficking, it's already happening. Yeah? But maybe there is room for improvement, and we can discuss that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I understand we can develop and on and on and on. Absolutely, we appreciate your insights and your perspective. It's extremely important. But I'm willing to ask you a question, even though I mean we over the time. But anyhow, the follow-up. Perhaps it's not completely appropriate, taking into account that now the Brussels is an efficient lockdown and pretty much there is such a security measures. But there, before the Paris attacks, some Europeans ask if those restrictive measures are not too restrictive in Central Asia, that it's used as excuse rather than genuine concerns. How you would respond to this one? That it's over-exaggerated actually threat from ISIS and terrorism?
Well, Kazakhstan tried not to exaggerate, actually. I think there was less exaggeration than in the case of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. Yeah? In terms of approaches to the problems, I think I emphasized that the government tends to use coercive measures, yeah? Which don't eliminate the causes of insecurity. Yeah? And that's something they need to address more. And hopefully, you know, what you do in EU somehow will have a positive effect on what we do, rather negative.
Okay, excellent, thank you. So let's proceed. Next one is Nazokat Kasymova from Tashkent State Institute of Oriental Studies and also United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime Regional Office for Central Asia. Nazokat, Uzbekistan was also mentioned here. Are you more insecure than Kazakhstan? I understand that Afghanistan is certainly not a second-tier challenge for you. It's quite a primary-tier challenge for you. So how you look on those security issues and challenges in Uzbekistan, please?
Okay, thank you. First of all, again, I would like to thank Host Institute for inviting me for this event and have a chance to talk with you and maybe respond to your questions. And first of all, I think my opinion that at present we are witnesses of the changing in the regional security paradigm in Central Asia. And it means that we have new challenges for security and stability in our region. And I also think that we have modifying the nature of conflicts and threats in Central Asia. And for Uzbekistan, based on its geographical position and geopolitical and geoeconomical factors, we can prioritize several challenges and threats. Currently, first of all, it's reconciliation and reconstruction in Afghanistan, and religious extremism and international terrorism. I also think it's drug trafficking and producing in Afghanistan, energy resources and water supply, and illegal migration. So, and again, for Uzbekistan, all of these challenges and threats have long-term issue. So, and again, our approach, our country approach is based on a new concept for foreign policy that our parliament approved in 2012. And main principles of this concept are the following. First of all, all problems in Central Asia should be solved by internally by countries of Central Asia. The second one, Uzbekistan, it still keeps its military status of non-aligned state. In the same time, I would like to say that we are really closely cooperate with NATO, and in Central Asia we are one of the key partner for this organization, and we cooperate with it from the 1991. And from the 1992, we are participate in the project Partnership for Peace, and from 1994 in individual program for cooperation and for partnership. And we stopped our membership in Collective Security Treaty Organization led by Russia in 2012. In the same time, we are against and we are not permitted the military bases on the territory of our country. And again, with all of these, our principles, we are also supported the International Security Alliance Force, which acts in Afghanistan currently. At example, in our military base, Uzbek military base in Termez, we give some places for the German forces and to keep the activity of these forces in Afghanistan. So, and again, I would like to maybe stop more because I have not too much time, but stopped more on the first priorities that I told before. What is the relationship of Uzbekistan and our attitude to the situation in this country, in our neighbor country? And here we are acting in two directions. First, so-called diplomatic and political issues, and another joint economic projects. And I would like to say that from the beginning, from 90s, Uzbekistan do not change its position to the supporting of peaceful development of this country. I mean, Afghanistan. Our country initiated the several diplomatic, proposals for developing platform for consultations and negotiation on this country, starting from the 6+2 initiative in 1997, and with the last initiative in 2008, the 6+3. And in the same time, unfortunately, maybe our last initiative were not so supportive by our partners, I mean by main powers, who is also involved to the how the situation was going on in Afghanistan. Again, our position is that first of all, we need to support to, again, peaceful development of this country. And from this point of view, we have number economic projects. And I don't know, maybe here in Europe it's not so promoted, but currently Uzbekistan is a key trade partner of Afghanistan. And we supported, the several projects in the field of the transportation, reconstruction, and electricity. We supply, I think Uzbekistan is the main electricity supplier for Afghanistan currently. And Uzbekistan is supported to build 11 bridges in road bridges between Mazar-i-Sharif and Kabul. We also supported the 2 railways constructed in Afghanistan from Hayraton to Mazar-i-Sharif and from Mazar-i-Sharif to Kabul. And currently we're in the process of implementing a so-called Trans-Afghan transport corridor that was, the agreement was signed between Iran, Afghanistan and Uzbekistan and funded by ADB. So, and it means that it's many things, good things it's doing to really support the changing and again reconciliation process in this country, because we are understanding that it's our neighbor and we are going to reduce all the negative things, that we can get from the situation currently that we have in this country, but in the same to support this country and its population for peaceful development. So, and again, this is our principal position, and I think we will to develop further the political dialogue with Afghanistan, with the neighbor countries and main powers on it, but again with focus on bilateral agreements and in bilateral format. So, because from the previous our experiences, we found the bilateral format was not so successful. So, thank you very much.
Nazokat, thank you so much for the very concise insight from Uzbeki perspective. And of course, you mentioned the dialogue, which is important among us and which is important in the region, which is important also with Afghanistan. But perhaps I would try to picture the bleak picture, that Middle East is in a turmoil, that Afghanistan is increasingly unstable. In northern Afghanistan, you see that there is insurgency and basically it's becoming more and more unstable. So we are in a region where there is no actually sort of the opening for the dialogue. There is a sort of the renationalization of policies, trying to protect yourself or themselves. How you see this one? Actually, that region is going more and more, or being challenged by more and more escalatory the challenges in the region. That is, it can be destabilized.
Again, my opinion is that it's much better to prevent the problems and conflict than to solve it after. And even with all of the last events and the problems that the European countries see now, I think, again, Central Asia is a really important region for security and stability for all the world. And in this case, I think we need maybe to find really good, really working platform, as I told, for dialogue, and including maybe not just the, how to say, the actors who is involved till now to this dialogue, but I think maybe we should also to invite the actors who is not actively in political field. I mean, with the negotiation of some of the partners. I think maybe we need also to invite the India, which the countries that has a strategic partnership agreement with Afghanistan, or Saudi Arabia, or the Qatar also. And I think maybe from this point of view, again, taking into consideration some contradiction between the different partners, but again, we should to put in the priorities that we really need to develop some kind of working model for reconciliation development of the Afghanistan, again, because this is a problem. It can be, it influenced and will be more influenced as the countries of Central Asia and other countries in Central and Eastern Europe. And again, of course, from the first point of view, you can see, so this is a different position of different countries and the different influence, degree of the influence. But anyway, less or small, it influence. So, and I think this is an issue should be solved.
Okay, excellent. Thanks. So let's proceed, since we already have more than 7 minutes each. So 3 minutes for European partners.
Sorry for
No, of course, it would be unfair. I understand, but I am trying to sort of to push down the limits and to make it even more concise. Neil, Melvin, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute from Sweden, but originally from UK, and of course, you being also the insider for many years and dealing with the region. How does the region look in a wider perspective? Please, Neil, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Andris, and the Institute and the organisers for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be in Riga, and I think, as was mentioned at the beginning, it's especially good to be here because Latvia has really been punching above its weight, I would say, on Central Asian affairs. And this is not just, I think, a question of putting Central Asia on the agenda, but actually helping the process of rethinking Europe's relationship to Central Asia. And that was, I think, you can see some fingerprints on the European revision of the European strategy, which I think are Latvian fingerprints, which is moving that strategy in a much more political direction, which it needs to do, and was a very good first step. But I think we're only on the beginning of this road of transformation. And what I want to do today is very briefly talk about some ideas I've been working on, which is the idea of Central Asia beyond European security. And this is a sense that, in fact, Central Asia is now not part of European security. It was originally, at least I can remember 25 years ago, Charter of Paris, which was almost to the day, 25 years ago, 21st of November. Central Asia signed on to those commitments, the comprehensive notion of security. This was the underpinnings of European security, and Central Asia was part of that. Since those heady days, we've seen a steady retreat in the region from that comprehensive idea of security. The consolidation of authoritarian regimes from the late 90s and through the 2000s, of course, undercut the human dimension. We lost much of our leverage on human rights and democratization, even though the EU and others have continued to try to press that. We've also lost a sense of Central Asia as a region, which was, of course, constructed really as a result of the Russian imperial agenda and the Soviet idea. Central Asia was European because it was part of a European colonial project. From almost the moment of independence, the Central Asians went outwards. They tried to break down those barriers. It was no longer a frontier with China and South Asia, but those borders were to be swept aside. So we lost that dimension. And of course, as a result of that, I think Europe has struggled to maintain its comprehensive engagement in Central Asia, and really, in many ways, we've lost ground. We've lost ground on almost all of those key dimensions, but also even on economic grounds now. And I think that's partly been because of the politics around Afghanistan. Central Asia is a difficult region because it's very complex. Everyone is there, the Americans, the Russians, the Chinese, we heard the Indians should be there, the Pakistanis, the Iranians, the Turks, everyone wants to have some role, which of course makes it very difficult to actually build leverage. And this is, I think, the key for Europe now, is we need to rethink how we can build leverage in a region where the leverage that originally came from those Helsinki commitments has largely vanished. Now, part of that, I think, was because of the multipolarity that dominated the region over the last 15 years. This, of course, came from many sides, but of course began with the US engagement, which was not about Central Asia, but was about Afghanistan, as they poured troops in, opened the bases, and sought to build the NDN, the distribution network. Secondly, of course, was the rise of China, and the transformation of the Chinese role in Central Asia. And thirdly was the revival of Russia. Now, in that context, of course, the Central Asians, rather than being subjects of the or objects of the great game, became subjects. As Alex Cooley has famously said, it was great games, local rules. The Central Asians actually turned the great game on its head and used switching between capitals to strengthen their control over their own countries and stop people actually raising human rights and democratization issues. This, of course, I think has undermined the European engagement, made it very hard, and we see that today, in which we're often chasing hard security, because that's what the Central Asians want to talk about, and concepts of human security and comprehensive security lag behind. We talk about terrorism and drug trafficking and so on, but not some of the root causes, including the politics of the region. So this is a rather depressing story in a way, but I would say that there is now an opportunity, a new opportunity emerging in the region, and that opportunity is coming actually from some of the transformations that have already been spoken about. Not transformations that are led by the Euro-Atlantic community, but transformations that's led primarily by China and the Chinese agenda. So we haven't touched on this yet, but of course there's been much discussion about what this means practically for the region, the Chinese Eurasian pivot, or the new continentalism, as it's called, the idea that China is going to build these dramatic transport, trade, and investment corridors from east to west. This is, I think, is an opportunity for Europe actually to build a relationship with China around that agenda, and in a way to try and use that agenda for our own purposes, to build a soft security dialogue as well as a hard security dialogue on Central Asia around issues of investment, rule of law, good governance, anti-corruption. These are all issues, of course, that China will ultimately have to face in the region. For despite China's power, what we've seen in the region is a colossal ability to actually construct trade barriers, to take money from people trying to build transit networks. I think even China is going to face this challenge in the region. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the Chinese money actually disappears in the way that a lot of the American money disappeared over the last 10 years. So there, I think there's a shared interest actually, not just in the hard security agenda, but also in the soft security agenda. And I think this is also a way to build leverage with the Central Asians, because unlike multipolarity of the last 15 years, Central Asian sovereignty is now being challenged in a way it hasn't been before by the double integration agendas, the Chinese integration agenda on one side and the Russian integration agenda on the other side. It's becoming much harder for the Central Asians to play the multipolar game that kept all the sort of great powers out of their domestic affairs. So there is an interest from Central Asians, of course, and we see this, are reaching out for perhaps the first time in some years, because they need Europe in a way they haven't needed it for many years. And that is, I think, the first time that we've had that leverage to actually say, well, the security agenda that you need, the investment and so on that you need, the balancing that you need with Moscow and Beijing, also comes with our own agenda, which is about some kind of reforms, reforms that must be about building long-term and deep stabilization in the region, to tackling some of these sources of radicalizations, the highly authoritarian orders there. And thirdly, I would say that there is an interest in Europe in actually building an engagement which is to prevent one particular power being able to dominate this economic transit corridor, whether it's China or Russia. This is the risk, of course, is that Central Asia, these developments I've been speaking about, this going out, may be closed off by these two projects. So I think this is also an issue for how Europe can engage with Russia around the security issue. Russia is the biggest security actor in the region. It will be the biggest security actor in the region. It's the only one who seems actually willing to put troops on the ground, which may be ultimately what's necessary. But on the other hand, it has an interest, I think, in not having an open-ended commitment to a region that could, I mean, the experience of Afghanistan is bitter. Is also about discussing with Russians how a policing operation and some rules of the game around what is legitimate security policing between Europe, the Americans, China and Russia may be very helpful for actually this wider project. So I think that security comes now from the region, not just from the hard security we touched on, but from diplomacy, from economic issues, and that is the way to rebuild this European comprehensive security. Thanks.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you. Excellent to have this wider picture. One of the issues is, the very quick follow-up question, one of the issues is the risk or a challenge of potential transfer of power. Sooner or later, it would become an issue. Would you see it as a source of instability, as a source of challenge for the regional stability and sovereignty, actually? And the moment when a great powers, be it China, be it Russia, might use this moment also to impose more their leverage on the region, on the countries.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, that's been a question, I think, that's been running around for many years. I've been to many discussions where we've all said there's going to be a power change, it's imminent, and we're still waiting. But I think, I mean, you're right in a way that, to me, what's happened is the discussion has changed, because it used to be, I think many people saw a sort of a nightmare scenario, that there would be Karimov would die and the whole of Uzbekistan might collapse and so on. But I think because now the context has changed, and we see that this region now has become much more important for big players. I mean, China's gas security is now highly reliant on Central Asia. It might not want it, but it has to have a security perspective on this region. It can't risk, I think, that gas supplies being damaged. And of course, Russia also has a big interest in terms of its it's changed its own policy. I mean, it used to have a sort of an old style, I would say, Soviet approach that Central Asia was Russian. Now I think it has a much more selective policy in which it's building client states, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, very classic client states, and then trying to use that to sort of build influence with others. Putin has already signaled very rather crudely that Russia will have an interest in the Kazakh transition with his comments about the Russians in the north of Kazakhstan. And I take that to be a very clear signal that Russia is saying that when the moment comes, they will be part of guiding that process. They want a person who is favorable to Russia and favorable to the Russian minority. So that, this means the stakes are much higher, but it could also be that helps stabilize a little bit because there may well be a wider dialogue. But again, it's going to be important that Europe and the United States are part of that dialogue because, of course, when those changes come, this will set a whole new trajectory for these countries, potentially.
Excellent. Thank you. So we proceed with Józef Lang, who is representing the Center for Eastern Studies, Ośrodek Studiów Wschodnich from Poland. And I understand that you would also a little bit elaborate on this great power game in the region and how it looks from Polish perspective. Please, Józef, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the Institute and organizers for hosting this event and for giving me the ability to speak. The catalog of security challenges and threats for Central Asia is quite a lengthy one, and it hasn't really changed too much for years. I mean, the talk is focused at times on one threat, then on the other, but the catalog itself it's obviously a vast one, but it's pretty much unchanged. What most of these threats and security challenges have in common is their internal origin. They're not necessarily external ones, but mainly internal ones of internal origin. And because they have been discussed at length at many, many different occasions, I'm not going to focus on them. Rather, I want to focus on how and with whom should we focus on them. With the current situation in Syria and the aftermath of the Paris attacks, there has been a lot of talks going on that Russia, with its operation in Syria and with its terrorism problem in Northern Caucasus, can be a natural partner for the European Union, for NATO, for the United States in Syria. And there have been such discussions about Central Asia and Afghanistan in the prior years. The question which is, has to be asked, therefore, is such a cooperation feasible? Is there a congruence of interests between NATO, between the European Union, United States, the West, and Russia when it comes to Central Asia? And another question is, are the Russian instruments which they have on the ground sufficient enough to deal with such threats and to help improve the stability? In my opinion, the answer to both questions is no. First of all, lack of congruence of interests. In Russia's interest is not necessarily the stability of Central Asia as such. What Russia tries to achieve in Central Asia is geopolitical leverage. It's control of the region. Due to Chinese advancement in the economic sphere, we cannot talk about neo-colonial, post-Soviet sphere of influence in all the spheres of public life, of policy and economics in Central Asia. Therefore, what Russia is increasingly focused on is security, because here it's unchallenged by China, which is reluctant to act in the security sphere. Yet Russia's activity in the security sphere does not necessarily mean actually providing for security. It means controlling the security sphere. We can see that with the biggest instrument that Russia has, the CSTO. As I've mentioned previously, most of the threats are internal. CSTO, its internal architecture, is designed to respond primarily to outside threats, furthermore to conventional outside threats. Central Asia is not facing much conventional outside threats. Rather, it is facing a number of quite dangerous at times, internal ones, which CSTO not only not only has limited capability of dealing with, but it has demonstrated its ability not to do so in case of the Osh crisis in 2010, where Kyrgyzstan asked for CSTO assistance and didn't receive any, showing that Russia can act only if its direct interests are threatened, and stability or lack of it in Central Asia is not necessarily such an interest. More recent case can be seen in September of this year with events surrounding General Nazarzoda, Tajik Vice Minister of Defense, who was declared a terrorist and organizer of a possible mutiny, and for several days he and his followers were hunted down by Tajik security services. We could witness two voices stemming from Russia. On one side, we had President Putin, who voiced his concern, who said about connections of General Nazarzoda with international terrorism, etc., etc. On the other hand, we had CSTO statesmen saying that it is Tajik internal dispute. We're not the ones dealing with it. So that's number one issue, that Russians don't necessarily have the instruments and don't necessarily have the same interests as NATO, as the West, and Central Asia. The question is, which follows is, who then does have such interests and who has such instruments? Well, first of all, it's the region states. I mean, they are interested also in the regions, in their stability. They're interested in lack of terrorism in the region. They're interested in some way in limiting the sources of those threats, even if they're not necessarily eliminating the sources. They, in theory at least, are interested in pursuing a path to at least limit them. And last but definitely not least, we should keep in mind that it's the regional states which have the most troops on the ground in the region. And even if the quality of those state structures, of their security apparatus, of their armies is not the highest and could definitely improve, that's the area that we should focus on. It's improving their capacity to cope with those threats, improving their capacity to limit and eventually eliminate the sources of those threats. And in this sphere, NATO has, and European Union, and the West in general, have a lot to offer when it comes to security sphere. I mean, the NATO agenda, the Partnership for Peace, does increase the capabilities of the armed services, for example, through peacekeeping training. And peacekeeping, unfortunately, may not be, Central Asian peacekeeping, unfortunately, may not be needed in other places, but in Central Asia itself. Therefore, such training, I think, is needed and right path to increasing the capacities to cope with the crisis. And furthermore, political and economic transition experience of Central and Eastern Europe can also be adapted to Central Asian settings. Thank you.
Thank you, Józef. I would play a devil's advocate on Russia's behalf. I should check it out. I would say that Russia has actually one of the only countries which have really hard power instruments in the region, or at least some willingness to impose some hard power. You can see the, if I'm not mistaken, 2,000 CSTO troops in Tajikistan. They might have created, as Neil also mentioned, client states in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, but perhaps it's a good thing. You might say that it has not solved the problem, but at least it has frozen the status quo. It somehow has stabilized the status quo. Perhaps it's good that Russia is willing to play at least such kind of role as arbitrary and, of course, playing its own interests, but at the same time somehow stabilizing the region and preventing from, let's say, terrorist sources or challenge from spilling over from Afghanistan into the region. How we will look at this one?
Well, first of all, when it comes to CSTO military presence in the region, it's not only Tajikistan, it's also Kyrgyzstan, where the Kant airbase is, the Russian Kant airbase is formerly a CSTO airbase. Yet this presence does not necessarily stabilize the region as such. I mean, just because the Russians have 7,000 troops in Tajikistan and they have an airbase and combat airplanes in Kyrgyzstan, does not necessarily translate to solving social problems, social tensions, sources of radicalization, etc. While the client states that I do agree that Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are to a large extent Russian client states. The client states that they created further contribute to sources of radicalization, sources of social frustrations, etc. Because what these client states are is creating a situation where the regime stability and the regime security is treated as state security and state stability, therefore not combating actual sources of radicalization, actual sources of social frustration, but rather combating only the most imminent threats for the regime itself. And from Russia's point of view, that is a good situation. Why? Because those states are strong enough to maintain some sort of degree of stability so that Russians can derive benefits from having regimes sympathetic to them in them, while at the same time weak enough to depend on Russia on their, first of all, political support for the regime itself, not necessarily the states as such.
Thank you, Józef. And let's proceed with Māris Andžāns. We started with Latvia, we made the whole circle, so we come back to Latvia, and Māris Andžāns is a fellow at Latvian Institute of International Affairs and also been quite active in the region, especially in the context of NDN, and traveled many times to the region as well. So what is NATO perspective actually here in all of this? Please.
Yes, thank you, Andris. So first of all, if we look at the engagement of different organizations in the region, it's quite surprising that maybe NATO has been more active than the European Union in the region, as we have seen different activities. So of course it's very important that during the Latvian presidency we managed to raise this issue on the agenda. Now the strategy is reviewed. Again, the special representative for Central Asia is reestablished, which is very important. But at the same time, what comes next? And this is also one of the issues that was raised. So we have to search for practical input, what could be done. And then here, one of the issues could be cooperation with NATO, maybe to try to get rid of some duplications, because we have seen, for example, the European Union is also acting in the border control issues and also narcotics trafficking issues. So maybe here is also something that could be done together. And as also mentioned by especially our Central Asian partners, then the NATO has been active for a long time. It was the Partnership for Peace, different activities, the defense sector reform, the exercises, different trainings, and then also the militarization project. So NATO has been very active. And and the cooperation, of course, deepened very much with the ISAF when the NATO took it over. And then we have seen different, let's say, engagements of the Central Asian states. One was what was mentioned purely in the civilian sector, that Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and the others have contributed to the infrastructure, building schools, bridges, railroads, providing also energy to the Afghanistan as such. And also the second big issue is the direct, or maybe the Central Asian governments would call it indirect support, namely the provision of their airspace and also inland surface transportation for the northern distribution network. So, and then why do I mention that? The ISAF is over. Now we have the mission resolute support, which is much smaller in scale. And accordingly, the NATO its presence, it's much smaller than it was, of course, previously in the region, and now it would be very important also for NATO to search for new ways how to engage, to try to find concrete issues on what to work. Otherwise, as they mentioned, NDA, and it very, how to say, deeply deepened the relationship between NATO and these partner countries. There were frequent visits, frequent cooperation, so this is like going up. And now it would be very important not to forget about Central Asia, because when I travel to these countries, it was quite often mentioned from these officials from these countries that this is not only about Afghanistan. So they felt in a way that the NATO, the European Union quite often, and also the individual allies are seeing them as second, let's say, class partners because they're interested in Afghanistan. But so maybe we should again refocus that there is not only Afghanistan, that there's also Central Asian countries as such, and that there are, as mentioned, also quite significant internal risks. And then last but not least, so this is again an opportunity for Latvia and the possibility to raise this issue further, to work on that. And also a few words about Latvia itself. So what we have seen, we have had, I think, excellent political dialogue. So I'm not good in numbers, but I think the Uzbeki president has been for 3 times in Latvia since the independence. And also Latvian presidents have paid, I think, also 3 times visits to Uzbekistan. We have had also exchange of visits with Turkmenistan and also Tajikistan. Also Latvian president has been in Kazakhstan. So we have had this political dialogue, but it's very hard, let's say, to sustain it if it is based on nothing. And if we look at the economic relations, so we have some success stories. For example, the transportation sector, the Baltic transit, the container train to Central Asia, which connects particularly the Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, but also the other countries. We have the direct flights, Tashkent, Riga, New York, which is also very important. We have many Central Asian students, and in fact, I think Uzbekistan is the second country by numbers by the foreign students in Latvia. So we have these issues, but at the same time, if we look at the numbers, only Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan make the top 30 for the Latvian export markets, and none of the Central Asian countries make the top 40 for the imports, and according to the first semester 2015. And in fact, 2 of those countries, they were on 0 during the first semester when it comes to the imports. So, and quite often, as we have seen, for example, when also Latvia and other countries open their embassies, there has to be something, some economic grounds. So we open are opening the embassies in such regions as India, South Korea, and so on. So these are the prospective markets. And this is again something that we have to try to foster the relationship here, and I think this is very important for Latvia not to lose the momentum, because there are not many advocates of the relationship with Central Asia, both in the EU and NATO.
I wanted to give a floor to the audience, but still you, by last sentence, you just provoked me. Why is there not so many advocates? Why would just we see that it's such an appealing region?
Yes, thank you, Andris. I think you can answer differently to these questions. So one thing was mentioned also by the distinguished keynote speakers. So first of all, we were in a common space during the Soviet occupation. So many Central Asian partners, say the inhabitants, have visited Riga. I have met many both in Tashkent, in Kabul, and other places that have been in Riga. They know Riga, Jurmala, other places, and of course probably there's the mentality that maybe we understand better than is it good or bad, but the Russian language that is also at a certain extent shared the knowledge, and of course the proximity. That is also a very important issue, because it is traditionally, and this is quite natural, that the Southern Europe cares more maybe about the Northern Africa or about the previous, let's say, colonies. So for Latvia and the Baltic states, it's quite natural that we see, let's say, the Eastern Partnership and the Central Asia in general as something that we have to work on. And at the same time, this is something also like a niche, that there are not many proponents for these issues, and that also offers the opportunities.
Okay, so let's open the questions for the audience, please. I see the couple of hands. Let's start with Maria, then over there, and then Thibault. Yes, please introduce yourself, and if you have some concrete question to concrete speaker, please, it would be nice. Doesn't seem so. Hello, she's Runa. I think this one is working, please.
Thanks. Okay, Maria Goldova from think tank Providus here in Riga. I'd like to thank Neil Melvin for an excellent analysis, and just to come back, not to repeat any of your points regarding the buried and forgotten human dimension of security, which it looks like neither the European Union nor NATO is keen to continue. I think that what Józef Lang has said about the client states, I cannot overemphasize how important it is, having worked mostly with civil society and not being a security expert. But the analysis on the ground and the analysis one gets from working with people on the ground is that in those two client states of Russia, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, the social fabric is in fact so fragile and so close to collapsing and has collapsed in many ways already, that we are dealing not just with the recruitment ground for ISIS, which we all know about, but also if one reads, for example, the report by International Crisis Group Syria Calling, one can see wider implications, which are both for Europe and for NATO. They're bad for our security, believe me. I mean, it's not some long-term perspective, but sort of medium and short-term perspective. If tomorrow from Afghanistan, God forbid, a few thousand men were to break into Tajikistan, and I'm not sure how much those Russian forces on the ground would really help. I mean, it's a state on the verge of collapsing. So that's one thing to take into consideration. I think that for Europe, and maybe even for NATO, but for Europe specifically, there is a very important thing to consider if we kind of limit our interaction with Central Asia to political dialogue and leave out work with society. And in fact, if we do not reconsider the way we help, especially Europe aid, which is spent, I mean, it's not a question of how much. It's quite much having been spent in the last 15 years, but the question of how. It's untransparently, it's giving mostly money to big international NGOs or government agencies like the German GIZ, etc., to implement projects which have lots to do with spending lots on Western expertise and infrastructure and very little to do with spending money on increasing the capacity of government and civil society to manage themselves. So I think we have to reconsider very seriously. I would be very grateful for comments from any of the panelists. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks. Please.
Thank you very much. Naftali Rifkin, U.S. Fulbright Program. So over the last decade, we've seen Latvia steadily sort of divorce itself of all things Russia, but we've seen some Central Asian states increase military, economic cooperation, and in many cases maintain pretty strong cultural ties with Russia. So strategic necessities aside, does this create any sort of tension on matters of principle that can form barriers between cooperation with Latvia and Central Asian states?
Okay. Yes, Thibault?
Thanks. Thibault Normand. I'm the owner of a company called Eastern Intelligence. We do a lot of corporate finance and security work in the region. I think I'd like to make a comment, and then there's a question. There's a word when you talk about Central Asia, which is nearly never used, and only Neil mentioned it very briefly, but otherwise it's considered a swear word. It's Iran. And I'd like to talk about Iran, because Iran has Caspian Sea border, has borders with Azerbaijan, has borders with other Central Asian countries, is concerned by a lot of the security issues, both in Kurdistan, Iraq, in Balochistan with Afghanistan. Iranians have, for the past 40 years, and even before the revolution, engaged in Central Asia from an economic perspective. Kazakhstan has tremendous crude swap deals with Iran. Right now, I know that, for example, the Kazakh state is trying to sell some of its oil and gas assets, and it's rumored that the National Iranian Oil Company is going to buy some of them. If you look at Azerbaijan, for example, a third of its dairy industry is owned by Iranian companies. And Central Asia has been for many years what you would consider the kind of strategic back garden of Iran in terms of strategic resources and reserves. If you know a bit about Iran and the Revolutionary Guard forces, they have an external operation force which is called the Quds forces. They're rumored for a lot of bad things, but what they do is they fly around at least once a week Central Asia in C-130 Hercules and 747 transport planes, and they bring back into Iran planes loaded with cows, milk, sheep, things like this. Now, that might sound funny, but it's food security, because Iran doesn't really care about energy security. They have what they have, and then they don't need to stress that. So when you have IRGC external operation forces going around Central Asia doing that kind of thing, it means that Central Asia is very important for Iran. And I think the question is if we as Europe are trying to strengthen our security agenda in Central Asia, and we're looking, as it was said, with who can we engage on that, and we've been trying to defreeze relations with Iran, why not engage with Iran? Why not use Iran, who has a tremendous expertise of Central Asia and who's been there for a long time and who has military forces, whether they're open or not open military forces around the region? I think that this is a country we should engage in, and I'd really like to have your opinion on that.
Okay, excellent. Some other questions? Andris, please.
I think China was mentioned, and but what was not mentioned was Chinese-Russian rivalry in Central Asia. And Mr. Lang did mention that, and I agree with him about that Russia cannot be trusted, but Mr. Melvin more or less said that, well, you have to cooperate with Russia, although on certain conditions. I would like to have a little bit more information about the Chinese and Russian rivalry, because obviously America has retreated after losing the bases in Kyrgyzstan and so on, a little bit more, because I think that's the big story. I think that's the big story in Central Asia. And by the way, thank you very much for your analysis, because we politicians cannot read everything, right? And we go to these countries, and we do need your analysis, and we thank you very much for that.
Just to add that Andris was a founder of Latvian Institute of International Affairs, so of course, thanks for contributing as well from your side. Yes, please, because I think since time is running out, we certainly take exactly the last questions in this round, and this will be also the final round, so please.
Thank you very much. My name is Mircea Raicu. I am a graduate student of international relations, and I have a bit of experience interacting with students from Uzbekistan. I lived with some people. Yeah, and they are very hospitable. My question is related to the radicalization of Islam, and apparently your countries, also Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, they are really aware of spread of radicalization. And in this sense, I want to ask you, is your policy regarding combating the radicalization of Islam related with the political regime? Is the fact that your countries have a very centralized political regime, is this a tool of combating the spread of Islam in your countries or not? Thank you.
Okay. Yes. Some other questions or comments? If not, we have two sets of questions, basically. One is more an external one, a great power game, Iran, Russia, China, and second one is more what's going on within the countries, the radicalization of Islam, the social fabric, the human dimension as well. So let's do it in reverse order, go back through the panelists, starting from Māris, please. You can touch questions that you would like to really go on.
Yes, thank you, Andris. I think I will touch only one and leave the rest for other speakers who might know those issues better. I'll take the one on Russia, which was asked about the Russia's role, so the relationship between Russia and the West is as it is, and due to the Russia's actions and aggression in Ukraine, and it's obvious that Russia, of course, is a very important actor in the region. And it's very unfortunate in that way that it's not, let's say, possible anymore to cooperate with Russia at the extent as it was before. So, for example, the Northern Distribution Network, so it simply does not function on the inland surface transportation without Russia, because Russia is where it is, and you have to cross it. And that's also a problem for the future if somebody is still trying to develop, let's say, this as a transport artery also towards China, so on and on. So in that way, it is unfortunate. And of course, NATO acted together with Russia, for example, with the NATO-Russia Council's counter-narcotics program. So that's, again, it's the issue where it was, but at the same time, the Central Asian nations, they are balancing different external actors and impact, and I think it is quite possible still to cooperate without Russia and then try to, let's say, balance the situation internally. And there, as I mentioned, there is need for concrete deliverables. Because it's also that will be probably continued by other speakers. This what you mentioned, the strategic, let's say, competition among different partners. So you have to offer something, because if there is competition, so probably, for example, China has many things to offer. Because I have seen as Chinese are working in Afghanistan, so many plants are building railroads, different infrastructure products simply coming with money. So the Europe and then the West in general can simply be, let's say, outcompeted in this competition. So I will stop there and then give a floor further.
Józef, please.
Thank you. So with Russia and China and the Russian-Chinese rivalry in Central Asia, there is definitely some rivalry between those states, those actors. However, mainly what is going on is the division of the spheres of influence. What Russia seems to follow and seems to pursue is stable division of spheres of influence, meaning China does conduct business activity in Central Asia. China imports its carbohydrates from Central Asia. Russia protects those trade routes. Russia protects the stability there, and therefore Chinese should consult Russia when it comes to political activity within Central Asia. So far, the Chinese seem to agree with such a modus operandi. Yet, they are building up their capacities, political capacities in the region. However, they are doing it cautiously, not to provoke Russian reaction. And the question is, will it ever be an open competition, or will it be sort of condominium of spheres of influence with China having the carbohydrates and economy, and Russia the hard security and politics? For me, it's an open question, and it's more a question of a Chinese policy than Central Asia. When it comes to Iran, Iran definitely is an important player in Central Asia. So is Turkey, India, Pakistan, South Korea, Malaysia, Japan. However, its role is similarly as Turkey's, is, in my opinion, often exaggerated. For Turkmenistan, Iran definitely is an important factor due to its Turkmeni gas and gasoline exports to Iran, and with the possibility of sanctions being taken down, possible Turkmen gas exchanges with Iran to export Turkmen gas via swap agreements further on west. But it's still a question of only one sphere and one country. In Tajikistan, which has language proximity and cultural proximity to Iran, we can see that the real level of influence of Tehran is not as high as is often portrayed. And when it comes to also just briefly mentioning Islam and radicalization in Central Asia, in my opinion, often the times radicalization is caused by actions of the authorities, not necessarily actions which are aimed at radicalization. Most often the times actions which are aimed at combating radicalization breed more radicalization. A good example of that can be the policy towards Hizb ut-Tahrir movement. Hizb ut-Tahrir is a political party. Its aim is to establish caliphate through peaceful means. Quite a radical aim and quite a radical goal, but its actions fit into, let's say, political spectrum of fringe movements, and it's legal in Europe. It's legal in Ukraine, and it hasn't caused much problems there. In Central Asia, it is actively combated, and often the times the Hizb ut-Tahrir activists, when they are sentenced and they spend their time in prisons, they do radicalize there, understanding that life is too short to try to establish caliphate through peaceful means. One should use armed struggle, and that is also interesting when in Central Asian news reports or in Central Asian statements, Hizb ut-Tahrir and terrorist organizations are put in the same sentence, while in reality, Central Asian terrorist organizations often criticize Hizb ut-Tahrir for their peaceful approach.
Thank you. Neil.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I'll carry on this Russian question, since it's a favorite topic, I guess, for everybody. And I think I have a slightly different perspective from the two previous speakers. I mean, Central Asia, of course, to me, it's a very complicated region. It's a very difficult region for anyone to navigate. And it's a region where lots of challenges are. And in that context, I think we have to just be realistic about what Europe's capabilities are, is that Europe is not going to send troops or even policemen probably to that region. And probably the Chinese aren't either. So if there is a crisis, then say it comes down to, is it going to be the Russians or is it going to be local forces that deal with these crises? I think the problem for Europe is that, well, there are two problems with hard security. Is one, Central Asians don't want it. We saw this yesterday, that the Turkmens rejected US assistance on the Afghan-Turkmen border. They said that they'll do it themselves. They're very sort of strong on the sovereignty, so they don't want anyone there. The second, perhaps bigger problem is that, and we've seen this before, that any kind of assistance, whether it's training or equipment, that is given to Central Asians, there's a big risk that the next week you'll see that used to massacre the local populations, we saw in Andžāns. And this is why, of course, the Americans couldn't really give a lot of their equipment from Afghanistan in the region, because there was human rights concerns that that would be actually used primarily for domestic repression, not towards fighting Islamists on the border. So I think those constraints are very real on what Europe can do. Given that, I think then we have to be realistic that the Russians are really the only serious game in town for hard security. And the question is, can we sort of hold our noses and find a way of dealing with the Russians, bearing in mind that I think that the fact that there is China now in the region means that Russian influence has a very strong check on it. It can only go so far in certain directions because of that Chinese interest. And I take it that all these things you have to say that about Russia, you know, Russia, why it's there and what its motives are. I think the question is, can in a way you sort of civilize the Russian security presence? You know, can you actually talk to the Russians about what would be a peace-building strategy, not just paratroops on the ground shooting people, but what actually would be peacekeeping, stabilization, civil forces, concepts of long-term stabilization and peace building, and what might Europe actually maybe contribute even in those areas where we're very good at those kind of things. And so sort of what might be the rules of the game for Russia. And this, I think, is in everyone's interest. I think there is a common interest. I mean, the Russians don't want total stabilization, that's clear, but on the other hand, they don't want a large number of Islamists penetrating to their border. That's clear. I mean, that is a big concern for them. And there are checks. I mean, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, frontline states, are not part of CSTO. So there's also limits on what the Russians can do. They only have Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan to some degree as sort of in the organization on that border. So I think there's also, you know, they look powerful, but there's also quite serious constraints, I think, on Russian power in the region. And that maybe is what the Europeans can try to maneuver a bit between the Chinese and the Russians on those issues. And this is the first time we can do this, maybe, because we are the sort of underdogs in the region now.
Excellent. Thanks. Nazokat, please.
Okay, thank you. So I would like to respond on three questions. First of all, the Islam radicalization in Uzbekistan, Central Asia. Again, Uzbekistan is a secular country. But again, Islam is a part of our history and culture and traditions. But in our country, we're considering radicalization of Islam in connection with religious extremism and terrorism. So and from this point of view, I think any government should ensure its population on stability and security. So, and again, for us, it's important, and it's one of the priorities that we are considering currently in our country in security issues. So another question was about the Russian and Chinese relationship, and I would like just to stress that again, Uzbekistan has strategic partnership agreements with both countries, and with Russia and with Chinese, and another good format that we are working together, Shanghai Organization for Cooperation. So, and the next year it will be the summit in Tashkent for this organization, and we are also hoping to continue our cooperation on energy resources, on economy, etc. And again, as Uzbekistan is put priorities for economy and trade and such kind of the issues between our two countries, and I mean the China and Russia. So, and also the question was really, and comments was really good about civil society. So, and again, I think that you're right, and European countries and Latvia should be more maybe active in supporting of civil society in Central Asia, particularly in Uzbekistan. And again, I worked many years with social humanitarian projects and also with GIZ, and GIZ and other European organizations, they done in doing a lot for Uzbekistan and for Central Asia countries. But again, for us, civil society, it's really a sensitive issue because again, it's, you know, we are just learning on values of, we're just constructing this society in our country. And I think of, as much as possible will be support and lessons learned from European countries that will be good for us. So, thank you.
Thank you. Please. Last but not least, yes, please.
Thank you. On China-Russia rivalry, I would agree with the previous speakers. It's in the embryonic stage, and China for Russia is a very important ally, so they don't want to, you know, to anger it. And China so far is quite content with this division of labor. Yeah. Okay, that Russia is in charge of security, China is in charge of economic development and this infrastructural project and so on. But Chinese experts are getting increasingly concerned with the, you know, they are not sure that Russia would be able to provide security. Yeah, that if something goes wrong, will Russia be able? And they saw what happened in southern Kyrgyzstan, 2010, and so on. So this is a big discussion also in Central Asia at the moment. What the Chinese going to do? And one option is, okay, they're going to use the private security companies to, you know, to protect the economic assets they have in the region without outright interference. Okay, on Iran, Kazakhstan had always, you know, good relations with Iran, and well, in the 90s we had these pipeline plans, yeah, because that's the shortest, most economical way to get to the markets. And now with this prospect of sanctions lifted, yeah, that's a big thing. That can be a really game changer. And I know that many. Well, not many, but Kazakhstani potential investors, they visit Tehran now, yeah, so they're trying to kind of to make deals and so on. So we are waiting for that, and there are activities there. Are Europeans doing something in this regard? I know that Norwegians, for example, they try to organize a platform for Iranian Central Asian cooperation, so there were already, you know, kind of some preps for that. On Russia in the region as a security provider, actually it goes beyond, our security cooperation goes beyond Russian bases in the region, yeah, because we buy Russian equipment, yeah, at cheap prices. Russia donates some equipment to Central Asian states. Then there are some joint ventures. Then, well, of course, our offices, they get training in Russia. So, you know, it's not just bases. Okay, so actually the security cooperation is quite strong. Well, apart from CSTO and all that. Now the issue of EU actually. Neil's provocative point about Central Asia being part of European security space or beyond European security space. I think from the very beginning we were partially in, partially out. Yeah, and I don't think it has changed much. Because if you take the issue of comprehensive security, except for the short honeymoon in the early 90s when we were sort of democratizing, yeah, since then, you know, it's not that we were strong on human dimension, yeah, but nevertheless we were part of all this, the security arrangement, OSCE, and kind of trying to report something on the human dimension. It's not that we were saying human dimension doesn't matter, yeah, we're saying, okay, you're putting too much emphasis on it, but it's not that you're denying it, yeah. In terms of colonial past, that you know, it's still relevant, this colonial past, yeah, in a sense that we are part of the, you know, part of the European cultural space to some extent. That is, our cultural references are largely European. We understand what's going on in Europe much more than we understand what's going on in China, for example. Yeah. So you know, I feel more comfortable in Riga than in Shanghai, for example, yeah, or in Delhi. So, and that's something that I think the EU should build on. Yeah, I fully agree that Europe cannot do much in terms of hardcore security. Yeah, there should be some security cooperation project that's very good. Yeah, and there should be socializing in terms of better approaches to security, addressing, you know, kind of a more comprehensive approach. But the real opportunity for me is in continued EU promotion of these cultural ties. Yeah? So it's socialization of political elites, socialization of Central Asian societies, yeah? In European direction. So retaining these ties, strengthening these ties, and improving trade regimes. That's also very, very important. Yeah? So basically, okay, trying to keep the region in its sphere, cultural sphere of influence. Yeah? I understand that human rights agenda, democratization agenda, that's a problematic agenda, especially now. But I would say that the EU remains I guess it's the only, actually, now strong actor in promoting human rights democratization agenda. For example, now in Kazakhstan, we have this pretty scandalous law on NGOs. It's not as scandalous as the Russian one, of course, but still it's basically aimed at controlling the civil society. And it's the EU who is putting up resistance, you know, trying to criticize that, and the European Parliament members, but also European Commission, unlike US, for example. Yeah? Actually, USAID supported this project. They said, okay, it will help to do a war on combating terrorism. Yeah? So you need this, you know, if EU disappears and the European criticism disappears, that would be a very sad situation in the region. So at least, you know, there are some, you know, an important reference provider, sort of. So, okay, probably I should stop here. I have some other points.
We can still continue at the coffee, and we can still discuss informally things. For me to conclude, very complicated subject. I think very complicated and complex region. It was mentioned here. I think we are dealing on several levels or several layers, and it was mentioned about the regional security and stability, about the national domestic fragilities and vulnerabilities, and also, of course, it is still a geopolitics are there as well. And in a shadow of the last days or last week's events, of course, the security is first of all on people's minds, and also how we deal with terrorism threat. Afghanistan has been an important part of the game as well. Afghanistan has made the region, in a sense, appealing, intriguing, important for rest of the Euro-Atlantic community as well. But of course, also Afghanistan sustains the region in a sort of the unstable situation as well. Of course, the security, if we discuss security, is beyond just Afghanistan. It's a much wider issue. Let's face it as well. And we already discussed here the China, Iran, Russia, India, and other countries. I think it's also beyond, we discussed Central Asia, just beyond security. The social fabric and social stability and human rights and non-governmental organizations are still important partners as well in cooperating and making a dialogue. I don't want to sound, of course, at the same time cynical, but it seems that at the moment it's not a season for human rights. With geopolitics last year's Ukraine events or Ukrainian crisis, Russia's aggression in Ukraine, or what we see now in Paris or in Brussels, of course, security is top priority number one. And as you mentioned, US even supports some things which we might deem as not always fully even democratic, because security is becoming a very important element. Let's face also this reality, let's face this context. But as you mentioned, I think very important is the socialization process, what European Union can do, what also NATO can do. I think what we did also today, socializing and also expressing the regional grievances, challenges, and also windows of opportunities, what we can proceed with. And this socializing element, this incremental socializing must be certainly continued. So I thank you to the NATO, where it is. I guess it's over there, or somewhere over there. I thank you to the audience for coming and joining us today. I thank you those who watched us in a streamline. A coffee is ready being made. And of course, last but not least, I thank to our speakers, distinguished speakers who came here and educated us through their perspectives and insights on the table. I think it is very important to continue this. If we want, as Neil said, to punch above our weight, certainly we actually can do just in a common effort, in a joint effort, because it's not just for Latvia itself. It would be impossible. And of course, thank you for the representatives from Central Asia, from Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. We're always happy to have you at the table and you to express how the perspective actually looks from the Central Asia. I think it's important to have this dialogue, which is very mutual and with reciprocity. So thank you so much, and please join me in a last round of applause, and the coffee is served.